in the Museum of the Jewish People, and to a certain extent, the history of the Jews is a history of migrations. I'm sure everybody around this room has a story of migration, either in their own generation or in previous generations. When we open the new core exhibition in a year, a full floor will be dedicated to the history of the Jewish people, and it will commence with a large display of Jewish migrations, where everybody will be able to trace their own family's story. Even now, in the new wing that we opened 3 years ago, and you're all encouraged to go visit it, there's a large gallery that has to do with synagogues. And these synagogues tell stories. Many of the stories tell the story of a void. Now, part of that void, when you go and see the synagogues in places like Warsaw or Berlin or Krakow, is one kind of void. But when you see the synagogues in Aleppo and Alexandria and Fez and Baghdad, it's a different kind of void. It's the void that was created when some 900,000 Jews left Islamic countries, sometimes of their own volition, but very often they were expelled. The story of that void, which Berak Futsot now plays an integral part in telling, is one that sometimes gets overshadowed. It's an important one. I'm sure we'll hear more about it this evening because it has ramifications and implications to this very day. It is not only a human story, it is also a political story. And I'm sure much more will be expanded in the evening that awaits us. But for now, I'd like to welcome a great Zionist and a great friend to the Museum of the Jewish People, Mr. Charles Booth.
Dan Tadmore, thank you so much for your words of welcome. Friends, as you will have noticed, Berak Futsot has rebranded itself as the Museum of the Jewish People. And whilst the work to refurbish it is still not complete, I think that we can already see the genesis of a new experience. It's a change from a static museum to an experiential one. The story of the Jewish people is one that cannot be confined to glass cabinets. It is a living and breathing, ongoing journey, and Dan Tadmore and his team have indeed succeeded in taking on this challenge. A special thank you goes to Liora Shani, who, with grace and charm, has made this event possible. Liora is in charge of events and conventions, and tonight demonstrates just how the museum is becoming an important part of the Tel Aviv scene. It's no longer just a static museum, it's a place to meet, it's a place where people exchange ideas, and really that is what this is all about. The panel discussion tonight is dedicated to our first Indian friend, Navtej Sarna, India's ambassador to Israel several years ago. To him goes our gratitude for enabling us to discover the magic of India. Hours spent in deep conversation about the parallels in our history are really what have sowed the seeds of tonight's event. Thank you to Ariella. You have been the driving force behind this event. You all know that when you set your mind to something, you usually achieve it, so well done. India has a big story. It's the story of the partition between India and Pakistan. A traumatic experience that gave birth to two nations where there had been one. There was some, I don't know, people say between 12 to 17 million people who migrated from one country to the other, leaving their homes, and in the process something like 2 million people lost their lives. It was a real tragedy. Its wounds, though historic, are still felt today. Israel also has a big story. It's the story of the Holocaust, another monstrous calamity that befell a people, and which continues to mark the psyche of the nation till today. But that's only half the story. I say half because half of Israel's citizens today can trace their roots back to their origins in the Arab Middle East. And whilst their story was less brutal than what happened during the Shoah or during partition, it's nevertheless a story that still marks the people. And it has, of course, a parallel in the story of the Palestinian Arab refugees. The collapse of British rule in both the Indian subcontinent and in the Middle East is really what was responsible for these mass migrations. And the purpose of tonight's panel is to compare and contrast these two mass migrations and to see whether there are any lessons that can be learned and shared from these two experiences. Tonight's forum is going to be much too short to go into this in great depth, but I hope that it's going to get people to be a little bit more curious about the story. Helping us tonight, we have three professionals. Lynn Julius, hi Lynn, is the author of the incredible book Uprooted that charts the history of the Jews in the Levant in North Africa and the ethnic cleansing that took place shortly after the rebirth of the State of Israel. It's incredibly well researched, and it's a book that future historians will turn to in years to come. Dr. Kinraj Jangid, hi. You have an ongoing research project here in Israel, which is comparing Nehru and Ben-Gurion, examining their similarities and their differences as post-colonial Asian leaders. Interestingly, Kinraj is also professor and director of the first Center for Israel Studies in India at the Jindal Global University in Delhi. Welcome. Finally, Matti Friedman, journalist and acclaimed author of the Aleppo Codex, Pumpkin Flowers, and the recently released Spies of No Country, which chronicles the lives of Israel's first spies, Jews from Arab countries who shortly after their arrival in Israel were sent back behind enemy lines. Welcome again. It's a privilege to have as our guests of honor tonight His Excellency Pavan Kapoor, India's ambassador to Israel, and his charming wife Aradna. During their mesmerizing tenure here over the last 3 years, the relationship between the two countries has reached new heights. It is under his watch that 2 prime ministerial visits have been the huge successes that we have all witnessed. From Modi and Netanyahu casually exchanging ideas barefoot in the Mediterranean, to the incredible reception that Modi extended to Netanyahu in the presidential palace in Delhi, all these are encounters that have been carefully orchestrated by our dear friend Pavan Kapoor. Let me conclude by saying that besides you being a great ambassador, Ariel and I share a deep friendship with you and Aradna. And not only will you be missed when you go back home, but you'll always be welcome here to visit our precious little country. Pavan, can I welcome you to say a few words?
Good evening, everyone, and Dan Moore, Charles, and Ariella, and friends. As Charles said, when Ariella sets her mind to something, she goes and gets it done. I think all of us who know her have figured this out, and I must say that it's due to her very clear understanding that this is something she wanted done, and in fact she was insistent that she gets it done before I head back home at the end of summer, and here we are. So it's actually happening, and I think Ariella, kudos to you to actually get it, and thank you all for being here. As Dan has said already, migration is something that is, it's actually as old as mankind. We've had migration of a voluntary nature all across the world. You've had people setting out for exploration in search of economic opportunities, and with great results. A country like the US has benefited amazingly with migrants from the European lands. I think even the state of Israel, for those who came here voluntarily for purposes of religion or nation building, have contributed amazingly. But this kind of voluntary migration doesn't lead to refugees normally. It's the other one, the forced migration, the expulsion, which is for reasons of war or other unfavorable circumstances that leads to refugees. And that's the kind of migration that we in India also saw in 1947 when the British colonial power finally decided to leave, but decided before they leave that they will split the land into two countries, India and Pakistan, and into three disjointed parts. So we were left in 1947 with West Pakistan, India, and East Pakistan. And what should be noted is that, when the legal arrangements for partition of India did not explicitly envisage or call for a transfer of population. Not necessarily, but it still ended up being, as Charles mentioned, in fact it's the largest case, the largest forced migration in the history of humankind. And around 14 million people crossed these frontiers on either side, around the same number on either side. And unfortunately it was also accompanied by mass violence and killings of both Hindus and Muslims. And it resulted in the death of anywhere between 1 to 2 million people. I know there are people here in the audience who have witnessed some of it themselves. I know from my own family's experience that they have seen it. But it was horrific, and that of course led to a huge refugee crisis. On the Indian side, the bulk of the refugees, there was a flood of refugees in Delhi. The nascent government there took it upon themselves to how do we resolve, and resettle these people. But it's interesting to note that the governments there, the receiving states as it were, and this was on both sides, decided that we will resettle the refugees because they felt that these are our own people. And so there was no suggestion about, okay, what is the sending state going to do? Are they going to sort of compensate us or whatever? There was no such talk about that. And it's also interesting that the partition, even though it was done by the British and there was concern at how it's being done, what is being done, but ultimately it was accepted by the leadership on both sides, which is not always the case. But anyway, when we had this flood of refugees, and in 1951, the census, the first census that was held in India, they say that about 2% of the population of India were refugees, which is a huge amount. But the government undertook its thing. But one thing should also be borne in mind, that when people came across these new borders, they were still in familiar territory. The language that was spoken, say across Punjab, when people came across or went across, it was the same language, the same clothes, the same food. So there was a sense of familiarity. In some cases there was family across. So there was this factor which helped people settle down, assimilate. And I have to say that, hearing from my own dad and others, within about 10 years, these refugees were back on their feet again. And then got into the life of the nation and became politicians, industrialists, bureaucrats. It should be mentioned that we've got two of our former prime ministers of India, Mr. I.K. Gujral and Dr. Manmohan Singh. Both grew up and spent most, a very important part of their life in what is erstwhile Pakistani Punjab. And another deputy prime minister, leader of opposition, Mr. L.K. Advani, who came from Sindh, he also came across and achieved this kind of position. But there are lots of such examples, and I'm sure you've got a very eminent panel here who will take you through all of this. But just to leave it on a slight personal note, just to say that my own family were refugees twice. They were earlier in British India, in Burma, in Rangoon in 1941 when the house was bombed by the Japanese. And then they moved to Lahore, another part of British India. And then 6 years later, in 1947, after that, got life going again. Was the partition of India again, and then they moved across from Lahore to Delhi. So that's a little personal note, but as I said, looking forward to a good discussion with the expert panel that we have here today, and glad that all of you can make it, and do I have the pleasure of inviting you all on stage. Thank you.
We'll get this all sorted out.
They've got you sandwiched in.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. The crowd was too big for the small room that was originally originally planned, so we've overflowed into the auditorium. It's a wonderful sign of interest in a subject that should be of greater interest than it has been until now. Maybe this will be part of a process that will see us talking about this more and more. What we're going to speak about in this discussion, which will be short according to Ariela's instructions, and as you heard, these instructions are followed to the letter. This will be a short discussion about two topics which should be discussed more often together. Two great upheavals in the world that happened simultaneously, beginning in the summer and fall of 1947, the partition and population exchange in India, what becomes India and Pakistan, and the partition and de facto population exchange that happens in Palestine and across the Middle East. And what we're going to do is make a case for the similarity of those events and perhaps offer a way of thinking about the birth of these two countries in ways that are similar. We've seen over the past few years, one of the few points of light in a dark political landscape over the past few years has been the improvement in ties between Israel and India. And this is going to continue, I hope, and one of the questions that I have is, what will this relationship be based on? I'm not a politician, I'm not a diplomat, I'm a human who lives in this society, and I would like a connection with humans on the other side of the line. So will this be a relationship that's based on weapons deals, or will it be based on a shared affinity for nationalist politics, or will it be based on an understanding that our countries are similar in the way they were born, and similar in many ways in successfully handling catastrophe and rebuilding. And I think that that is a better way of viewing a relationship between the two countries, and I think a relationship that's purely based on cold interests or perhaps an antagonism toward Islam. That would be a big mistake, and it would be a missed opportunity for us here. I think that if, as Israelis, we're going to have this discussion, we first have to attack two myths about our own country. Once we dispose of these myths within 1 or 2 minutes, then we can have a discussion about the similarities between the birth of Israel and the birth of India. One is the idea that Israel is a European country. And when I came to Israel, I was born and raised in Toronto, and I moved here in 1995, and what I had in my head about this country were very simple stories, most of them about Europe. So I knew about Theodor Herzl, and I knew about pogroms in Europe, and I knew about the kibbutz idea, socialism. Of course, I knew about the Holocaust, and that's what I knew about the country. And then I came to this country and realized that those stories do not explain the country. Because what you have here is actually a Middle Eastern country, and half of the Jewish population of Israel, even if we set aside the 1/5 of our citizens who are Arab Muslims, half of the Jewish population here has roots in the Islamic world. And their presence has shaped our politics, it's shaped our religion, it's shaped our cuisine, it's shaped our pop music to such an extent that I think we can even discuss that element of the Israeli population as the dominant element of the Israeli population, which is not the way Israelis tend to think of it. We still tell you a very European story about Israel and see the Jews who came from the Islamic world, we call them by this very gross generalization, Mizrahim, we see them as a footnote to the story. And even many people who come from the Islamic world see themselves as a footnote to the story of Zionism, when in fact what we have is a country that is as much the product of a population movement inside the Islamic world as it is a product of a population movement from Europe. And that's not the way we tend to see it, but that is in fact the country that we have. So we have a Middle Eastern country. Okay, that's myth number one. So we've now learned to see the country in a whole new light. The second myth is about Aliyah, and what Aliyah is. One of the genius moves of the Zionist movement early on is to equip people with a vocabulary that allows them to describe themselves as something other than victims. So you have people in Poland whose lives are miserable, and they're afflicted by pogroms and by discrimination and violence and all kinds of persecution. They can no longer remain where they are, and they have to leave. But they don't want to be refugees. So they tell a different story about themselves. In fact, they are not being rendered homeless because their home was never in Poland or Russia or Ukraine or Germany. In fact, their home was always somewhere else, and they were planning on going there anyway. And they're not refugees, they're pioneers. They're chalutzim. And they're not running away. It's called aliyah. It's called going up. So people who are functionally refugees who are being forced out of their homes invent a whole different story for themselves, and the story is so effective that it works. And the mindset of this country has never been a refugee mindset, because we have this narrative which is, let's face it, it's largely fictional or could be told in a very different way, but it is so powerful that we become convinced that it's true, and very few people here think that they're refugees. We think we're olim or chalutzim, and we think we're home. But the fact is that most of the people who came to the state of Israel would not have come had they had any other choice. And that is an uncomfortable fact about the Zionist movement that we choose not to talk about for good reasons, because we don't want to be victims. But if life had been good in Germany, the Jews would have stayed in Germany, just like they stayed in America and they stayed in the UK. If life had been good for Jews in Iraq, I'm going to hear more about that in a second, they would have stayed in Iraq. Life was so bad that it triggered a mass exodus. Mass exoduses do not happen if life is good. We've chosen to disguise a story of helplessness with a story about strength, and that story becomes so convincing that we forget that it's a kind of disguise. So if we accept that this is a Middle Eastern country that is populated in large part by people who were displaced inside the Islamic Middle East, then what happened in 1948 is a population exchange, in which Palestinian Arabs, mostly Muslims, the Christian minority, lose their homes in what becomes the State of Israel. And a number that is similar, slightly higher, according to most counts, of Jews who were native to the Islamic world lose their homes in the Islamic world and come here. It's not the way we tend to see this country, but I think it is at least one accurate way to see this country, and that I think might allow us to have this very short discussion that we're about to have. But I think let's start with you, Kinraj, because I think that for many people here, certainly for me, even just a month ago, I knew nothing about the India partition, I'm embarrassed to say. I've read a few books and I'm an expert. I could for hours about it, but we have a real expert here. So can you just tell us what happened in India in 1947 and how you are personally connected to it, how it impacted the life of your family?
Well, thank you so much. Let's say I'm honored with the change of the sequence here. But thank you very much. I must thank Ariella for inviting me to join this event and share some of the work that I have been doing. My own training is in international relations and foreign policy and diplomatic studies. I studied Israel studies for my doctoral thesis, and I worked on the... I have one. Thank you. So I come to this subject from my own PhD work, which was to understand the history of the 1948 war. I worked on the historians, and that's when I understood that there is so much common between Israel and India at the genesis. Lately, for a year, I have been working on a research work which compares Ben-Gurion and Nehru in terms of their political similarities or differences, but they are remarkable two post-colonial Asian leaders. And in this journey, I chanced upon meeting Ariella, who told me about this topic, which was certainly very, very new to me. I must confess that even after studying for 6 to 7 years for a doctoral thesis in 1948 war history, I did not come across the subject of Arab Jews. Forget about the number, just the fact that so many of them really got out of their homes and came to Israel. So as Mati said in the beginning, I came to this country as a student in 2012, thinking it's a European kind of a place because people came from Europe and they are white and this is what they are. And I was completely in a surprise and a learning with the help of this book. So my part here today is to bring about some aspect of the Great Partition of India and see what can be compared or what cannot be compared. So let me start with a few things about the partition as it happened. And before I do that, I would just speak briefly about the concept of partition in the modern nation state or in the modern world history.
Can I hear? The mic is not working. Take notes.
I think it's working now. So I think it's important to understand this partition as as a political thing, because I think that's how every place got into it. That partition as an idea and concept has its inevitable engagement to the idea or a need of a state and a sovereign state. It is in a way was conceived in India in 1947 and is still being believed in many parts of the world as a precondition for a state. In the case of India and Pakistan, partition was supposed to solve national problem with the emergence and articulation of two-nation theory by the colonial masters, but as well as by the Muslims and Hindu leaders in the beginning of the 20th century. I think Ambassador said something very important here in the initial remarks, that the partition was an imperial invention in a way as a strategy, but it was still bought by the national leaders. And that acceptance played a role of collaboration with the two-nation and two-people theory. The political partition of India caused the great suffering that is considered never and since before this event. Now, far from representing a natural solution to the ethnic or a conflict problem, partition was sold as a conflict resolution. And the concept of partition is no more than 100 years old, by the way. It's a product of exceptional violence in the 20th century. It first emerged out of the new conversations which were about ethnicity, nationhood, and citizenship during and immediately after the World War I. The idea of partition and formation of the nation state around one people, one state was part of a larger effort in the world done for the sacred cause of statehood. It is still around, as we could see in the case of Sudan, or as it was talked about Iraq just recently. In this story of great partition, which impacted a significant part of South Asia, East, West, and the larger part of India, in all of this story, it was only one remarkable politician or a philosopher who understood what's going to happen, and it was Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi was suspicious not only of this inevitable partition as was presented, but also of the sanctity of nation state. To Gandhi, first of all, partition was arbitrary and violent. Drawing a line and dividing the land was a violent act, as was the division of people. And to stop it, Gandhi was deeply against the idea of the partition, and he even offered Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was the national father of the idea of Pakistan, the Prime Ministership of United India, if this could prevent the partition. I think this critique is very important. And Gandhi wasn't only critiquing the so-called inevitable partition, but he was also, in a way, warning people to sacrifice everything that they civilizationally earned to throw away in the name of a nation or for the sake of a sovereign state. Now, the first experiment, and the story of India's partition doesn't begin in 1947, by the way. To me, it begins in 1905. This is when the first partition was done by the British in India. Britain was operating from east of India, the great province called Bengal, which had more than 80 million population. Kolkata was the official capital of British Empire. And the division of Bengal was conceived in 1905 by Lord Curzon. It was a great event, by the way, but I think this is remarkable. This is when the British really did the partition thing in their imperial strategies. What did they do? So Bengal at that time had a huge part of Bihar, Odisha, and Assam, 80 million of a population, and Lord Curzon suddenly said, well, let's divide this place into two on the religious basis. The east will become a Muslim Bengal and the west will become Hindu Bengal. This partition was primarily on the religious line of thinking. And understand this, that in the European nationalism, all nation states mostly developed out of the linguistic identity. So it's the language that province, and it failed. It did not prevent the British Empire to resell the idea in 1946-47. And something changed in the decades from 1911 to 1947. And I think this is where the Indian national movement saw the split, when Indian Muslim League went on articulating a separate state for the Muslims of India, claiming that they are different people. And the agent of this partition on behalf of the British Empire was Sir Radcliffe. And Radcliffe was just sent, and a British poet, H. Auden, he said it very remarkably. It's 4 lines, but I think he spoke very poetically, and I just want to read that. So I quote, "Unbiased, at least he was when he arrived on his mission. Having never set eyes on this land he was called to partition, between two peoples fanatically at odds, with their different diets and incompatible gods." Now, the poetry is also a problem, as problematic as the British imperial politics. The last sentence says, with their different diets and incompatible gods. In the South Asian context, the gods were not so incompatible, and people were not so fanatically at odds with each other. There was a greater syncretism, a greater harmony of the religious coexistence in the Indian subcontinent. I'm not going to romanticize that past, but certainly there is a case to be made that religion wasn't that remarkable line of division among the people. And the example of it is actually something that happens in that part of the world in 1971. So imagine in 1947, a certain amount of Muslims demand a state called Pakistan on the basis of their religiosity. And out of the same group of people, the Muslims of Bengal say we are no more that Muslim like Muslims of Punjab, and we want a state of our own. So we had a creation of a new state in 1971, which is based on linguistic oneness. So Bangladesh is a creation of a separate state from a Muslim state called Pakistan, which just came about in 1947. So people become more Bengali and less Muslim. So this is just an illustration of the I think, Indian subcontinent. Partition then, in other words, was not an independent, freestanding solution to anything. It was an idea that was invented in very particular circumstances by empires trying to expand their lifespans via the deployment of the characteristics of nation states. And I think it's a very important point to understand as post-colonial Asian people, that partition was not a way of life in sync with the lives that were lived in that part of the world. Though I do not extend to this argument and say, well, everything was so good in India before the British came to rule, or the fact that the indigenous nationalist leaders like Nehru or like Patel or like Jinnah had no role in buying that British narrative or the European narrative and then helping the partition. So it's not to take the blame off the people, but it is still very important for post-colonial people to understand what did empire do in its hour of departure to this part of the land. And we might be just dealing with that yet. Which brings to me the next point, which is that partition is not a one-time, once upon a time event. India still lives the unfinished business of partition. And I'll give you 3 more examples. By the mid-90s, it was no longer possible to regard partition as closed events that belong to dusty history books. They were clearly ongoing processes, continuing to shape the domestic and foreign politics in the newly created countries and leaving their imprint on core aspects of everyday life. and I'll give you a glimpse of this everydayness of partition. Right now we have a great or grand general election. The biggest democracy of the world is right now exercising its ballot. More than 800 million people are going to vote. Half of them have voted. And if you really just look at the newspapers, what's the agenda that this grand, largest democracy of the world is fighting for? Pakistan is the agenda. It's bizarre that a country of so many decades, a state which is looked by the world with so much promises, has so much deeper anxiety that it yet can't grapple with what happened. So go to Pakistan is the immediate abuse one gets these days in political conversations. So anyway, this is one of the examples. The other is the creation of Bangladesh. The third would be the sub-nationalism that happened in Punjab. Khalistan movement was a movement which was very violent in India side of Punjab, where certain groups in Punjab realized that they have a language, their gods are different, they are not Hindus, they have their language and culture. Why shouldn't they have a nation state of their own? Why shouldn't they fight for sovereignty? To me, that's an unfinished business of partition. Or to me, that still is the identity crisis that was created in the name of the nation state in 1947, and people just couldn't figure out. Because, as Mr. Kapoor said, it's very difficult for a Punjabi who speaks the language, lives the culture, to suddenly take Indian side or Pakistani side. It's an identity which is top-down given. I come from Rajasthan, which is Marwar, and for me, Marwari language, food is the essential identity. I don't relate with Tamilian except with the flag of India. We don't understand the language of each other back there. So that's the story about Punjab. The third thing that's happening, and to me it's an unfinished business of partition, is the story of Kashmir. There are two Kashmirs, and one part of the Kashmir is with India, other part of Kashmir is Pakistan. And I think to me, the identity of the Kashmirian is also in that crisis, where to be a Kashmiri is much more existential than to be an Indian or a Pakistani. So that's that. What can one compare about this crazy balagan? which is a huge chaos. I mean, it happened in a bloody way. It still has impact on our everydayness. We live it every day, or somebody imposes it on the other to live. Here are my initial submissions, and I would really like to hear more from you. The two partitions, one in mandatory Palestine and the great British Raj in India, deserve a comparison. Why? Not only the fact that these spaces were partitioned almost simultaneously, but also they are astonishingly similar political trajectories. It's true that India and Israel were not on talking terms, but the fact that they both dealt with the British imperialism had something to do with it. And certainly the partition was sold or brought into the conversation here to solve the so-called conflict between the Arabs and the Jews. In a similar way, it was brought to India to solve the conflict between the Muslims and the Hindus. The list of historical parallels includes a political vocabulary which was used to describe in both these places the ethnic and religious conflict. So the conflict was from anti-colonial national movement in India, it was turned into a religious conflict. Ariella just used the word while we were having coffee, that partition is a religious partition. It did occur to me before you said it at the coffee table, that the partition of Great India is a religious partition. And that, I think, is a vocabulary that was brought by the British in both parts of the world. Hindu and Muslim states in South Asia and Jewish and Arab states in West Asia. One may argue that the case of India and Israel Palestine under the British imperialism is not much different because the colonialism wasn't the same. In the case of India, it lasted for 2.5 centuries, whereas in Palestine it remained limited to 30 years. Yet, I think the impact of ending of British Empire and its imperialism in both these places is a remarkable comparison. That British Empire ended in a very similar way in both these places. Partition succeeds in India with population exchange, but it fails in Mandate Palestine. And to me, there are some reasons very important to understand what happened and what didn't happen. There was no readiness to collaborate with the idea of partition in Palestine. The Palestinians and Arabs rejected it. Therefore, partition failed here. The acceptance by the two wasn't achieved by the British, or they had no time to cultivate that collaboration as they could do in India. As I said, if they introduced partition in 1905, cancel it in 1911, still bring the idea back in the 1940s, to me it seems like an idea worked upon. In Palestine, they just did not have time. Not to say they could have brought some better results, but just to play with the idea of what happened and what couldn't happen. No matter it was a top-down act in India, at the end, masses bought the British narrative. And so, Muslims were sent to Pakistan and Hindus were forced to move to India. We call this quote-unquote population exchange. And those who did not or could not move were given protection from retributive violence or the reactionary violence with the help of minority rights later. In the case of Palestine and Israel, the population transfer did not happen. A, because the idea was rejected. But more importantly, I think, because there was no two states at the end. So in the absence of a Palestinian state, who does talk about the population exchange? And Arabs did something more difficult by negating and completely denying the Jewish identity of the Israeli state. So the territories which were left, West Bank, east of Jerusalem and Gaza, were occupied by the Arab states. I don't say they were controlled by the Arab states because to me, from outside it looks like occupation from 1948 till 1967. Palestinian state could have come up there, but that doesn't happen. So there's a larger regional politics that also doesn't help the idea of the population exchange or population transfer. If I have more time.
I think we need to.
Let me ask you another question. Do you want to say one more thing?
Just one more thing. I think in this historical event, I think I have said this, but let me just say the concluding remark that what I take away from this comparison, or what I take away from the Indian partition and its knowing, it is sad but true that states and sovereignties have become the paramount political values in most part of the world. The state is sacred and nation is above all other things. That is why, to me, Gandhi's critique of partition in the state is very significant takeaway. We human beings are much more than flags, borders and territories. By realizing a larger purpose, we might be able to mitigate or reconcile with the past political violence which was in the name of a state or for the sake of a state. To me, there lies the problem. Thank you very much. If I more time,
Then when you wrote this book, Uprooted, which I'm going to hold up, although I'm sure you've all read it many times and own several copies, and if you don't, you can get them from then after the talk, you choose to use the word refugees. And you come from an Iraqi family that experienced displacement. Why do you think of that population as refugees when most of us, I think, don't? And how did your family experience that great population movement of Jews who were native to the Islamic world out of that world, mostly coming here and some kind of scattering in points farther west?
Well, as you say, my family came from Iraq. It's the oldest Jewish diaspora, going back 2,600 years to the destruction of the First Temple and the captivity of the slaves from Jerusalem to Babylon. And that community was in existence continuously up until 1950. So in 1950, there occurred the dissolution of the community. Virtually 90% of the Jews left. And they left to come here. There was an airlift, Ezra and Nehemiah, I think it was Operation Ezra and Nehemiah. But my family personally was in a minority. We came to England. And I think the fact that 200,000 out of the 850,000 Jewish refugees, I do call them refugees, from Arab countries came to places other than Israel, meant that they were refugees. They did not come out of Zionism, obviously. They did not go to England out of Zionism. They went, in my family's case, because my father did study in England during the war. He went back, he married my mother, and he thought he would have the best prospects if he came back to England. He had some connections, and that's really why he thought he could rebuild his life in England better than in Israel. But a lot of people did not have a choice. And in fact, in the Iraqi case, the Jews were stripped of their nationality when they left Iraq. There was a year, a window of opportunity to leave Iraq. Before that, Jews were not allowed to leave Iraq at all. They were hostages. And there was a period of persecution, there were executions, it was a terrible time. And this window existed for a year, and then the Iraqi parliament passed a law freezing Jewish property. So these people left with nothing. They left with a suitcase and 20 dinars in their pockets. And when they came to Israel, they came to terrible conditions. They came to the Mabarot, the tent camps, or the camps of tin huts or wooden huts, and some of them stayed for 13 years or more. In my family's case, we were lucky that we were not put in a camp, but say the Jews from Egypt were definitely put in camps. Certainly those who had to leave in 1956, who were expelled virtually overnight by Nasser.
Had been there for more than 2,000 years, decided to pick up and leave to the very last person.
Right. Well, of course, there was a lot of popular violence surrounding the partition, or the declaration of independence of the state of Israel. Violence did erupt in Aden, where 87 Jews were killed. There was terrible violence in Syria. There was the threat of violence in Iraq, although nothing actually happened. But in
1941,
it certainly did. The big shock happened in 1941, as you say, with the Farhud, which was the massacre of Jews over 2 days, over Shavuot, and nobody really knows exactly how many people died, but it is thought that we know that 180 Jews were identified as having died, but there could have been many more. Whole families were massacred in the Jewish quarter of Baghdad, and there were no witnesses to their deaths. So that was the big shock for the Jewish community of Iraq, and that was 7 years before Israel was declared. And in fact, my mother's family was so traumatized by the experience of the Farhud, even though they did not lose anybody and no property was taken from them, that my mother's family actually moved to Iran for a year or so, and then to India, because it was much easier to actually go east than to go west. Don't forget the Second World War was raging at the time. And my mother spent 18 months in Bombay. She was a schoolgirl at the time, and in the very hot summer in India, she remembers going to Pune, which was much cooler in the foothills of the Himalayas. And there were several examples of Iraqi Jews who did migrate to Iran and stayed there, some of them till the Islamic Revolution, in fact, in 1979, and also Jews who went to India. But most of those did return to Iraq after the war. Several reasons for that I could go into. I think they were a bit unnerved by this rising tide of nationalism in India, this talk of partition. My mother remembers seeing the words "Quit India" on the walls. That was addressed to the British. And of course, there weren't the job opportunities that these Jews were looking for, because they were basically merchants, and Iraq was actually a better place to be. So they went back in 1945 to Iraq. But of course, it wasn't going to be for very long, because by 1950, things had got bad again. The situation in Palestine had caused a deterioration in the conditions of the Jews in Iraq, and of course they all felt they had to leave. There was no future for them.
So what you have is a kind of a story of people who thrive under empires, or thrive as long as there are no concrete national borders. You have people moving around, Jews who are in the Ottoman Empire. They don't know if they're Iraqis or Syrians, or no such identities exist. There are Jews in the Middle East, they're here and they're there, and you have Hindus and Muslims in India who move back and forth across borders and who share identifications that aren't necessarily religious. I'm Punjabi, you're Punjabi, we speak the same language, we eat the same food, but religion wasn't necessarily a dividing line. And then modernity happens, and people have the idea that now we have states, and these states have borders, and you're a citizen of state A or state B, and that's the world we're living in, and many people fall by the wayside. This is an amazing book that I just read called The Other Side of Silence, which is about the partition of India. And the author, Urvashi Bhattalia, who's a prominent Indian scholar, tells a story of a woman. She's at a literary festival in Karachi, and a woman comes up to her. This woman is 84, and her name is Shehnaz. And she's a Muslim woman from Pakistan. And she tells her this story. The story is, she was born with the name Harbhajan. And she is born Hindu, in a Hindu village that, when partition happens, becomes Pakistan. And she's in a refugee convoy. There were these vast convoys of people on foot marching to India or marching to Pakistan, depending on your religious affiliation. They were marching toward India when she was abducted, which is a common story, and married by the man who abducted her, converted to Islam. So from Harbhajan, her name becomes Shehnaz, and she lives a life as a Muslim in what is now Pakistan, and she has 5 children with a Muslim man. In the 1960s, there's a warming of relations between India and Pakistan, and she manages to get back to India. She finds her parents. She reverts to being Harbhajan, a Hindu woman. She's forced to separate from her children because they're Muslims and they're left behind in Pakistan. And she, now alone in India, as a Hindu woman, again, marries a Sikh man, raises his son from a previous marriage. They emigrate to the United States. Her husband passes away in the United States, and her son hears for the first time this story about his mother's previous family, the Muslim family, and he finds them in Pakistan. She travels back to Pakistan. She becomes Shehnaz again, her second identity, the Muslim identity, and lives, and she's in her 60s by this point, and when the author meets her, she's 84, and she's now that again, but she has this story of back and forth because she's an impossible character. Political realities were imposed on this woman. And it reminds me of this, I just wrote a book about 4 of Israel's first spies who are Jews from the Arab world. I'll just give you an example of one of them who's from Damascus. He's a young man. His name is Jamil Cohen. And Jamil Cohen decides that he has to leave the Arab world because of hostility, because he sees no future there for Jews. They're native to Damascus. He comes to Palestine to join the Zionist movement. He starts using his Hebrew name. He calls himself Gamliel Cohen. He's recruited by an early intelligence unit called the Arab Section, which was part of the Palmach. But they don't want him to be Gamliel Cohen. They need him to be Jamil. They need people who can pass with Arab identities on the other side of the line. So now he takes on a third identity. Now his name is Yusuf el-Hamid, and he's a Muslim from Palestine. And under that false identity, his third, he's sent back into the Arab world as a spy. And these were Israel's first spies. They had these stories. They're one thing, they're another thing, they're this thing. And a few years earlier, they just would have been Jews in the Middle East. But national boundaries and national identities were forced on them, so now they had to be Israelis or Arabs, and those are 2 mutually exclusive things. You have to be a Jew or an Arab. Those weren't necessarily mutually exclusive, so this new reality forces us into kind of uncomfortable accommodations. Now, what I wanted to ask you, Ahmed, is about the question of return. Right? The word return here looms very large. Of course, Jews have a story about return, which is carried through 2,000 years in exile. The Palestinian refugees have a very strong component of their identity, which is return, the right to return. Is there a parallel idea in India, Pakistan? Do people who were displaced in the partition dream of returning one day to their ancestral villages? Does it work the same way?
Well, we didn't have this in any significant way. As was said by the ambassador in the beginning, there was a larger acceptance. The two-nation theory was bought in a significant way, not only by the leaders but by the people themselves. And within a decade, by 1960s, they get to their lives in their new homes and new places. And it is still in the similar South Asian, religiously, culturally integrated world where they could identify with the other. I think in any case of this migration forced, 2 things have to happen. Acceptance by the host and a sense of belonging to cultivate. In India and Pakistan, that happened simultaneously. They were accepted by the other and there was a place to belong to. It doesn't happen in the case of Israel-Palestine because Palestinians don't get accepted in many places.
Half happens. It happens to one side but not to the other side.
Limited way in Jordan.
No, it happens to the Jewish side.
Yeah, no, I'm coming there. That the right of the returning thing doesn't happen in India because of acceptance and the cultivating of belonging. It does happen in the case of the Israel and the Arab Jews, but it doesn't happen in the case of the Palestinian Arabs who go out. They could relate to or belong to, but the acceptance is not granted. So it's a difference that we can think of.
Then, do you agree with the term Arab Jews? Do you think that you're Arab?
Absolutely not. First of all, the Jews were there before the Arabs. I mean, 2,500 years. The Museum of the Iraqi Jews in Or Yehuda is called the Museum of Babylonian Jewry, the Museum of Babylonian Jewry, not Iraq, notice. So
because Iraq is a new name.
Yes, that's right.
And Iraq is a British colonial fiction, like other countries.
And the whole Arab identity, I would argue, is an artificial, imposed identity according to the language you speak. And as you know, all these countries went through a colonial period, although much shorter than in the Indian case. And I think a lot of Jews felt that they weren't Arab at all. They felt they were French, for instance. And here, when the first waves arrived of Jews from North Africa, of course they were known as Frankim.
Which was a pejorative term.
Which was a pejorative term, but it referred to French culture. And you know, a lot of Jews here might have a nostalgia for Kulthum and the you know, Arabic tunes of their youth and everything. They may have an affinity for Arabic culture, but they would deny quite vehemently the fact that their identity is Arab in any way. You know, they are a separate ethnicity. When they were living in Arab countries, the Arabs didn't consider themselves Arab. You know, it was a different community. It was a separate community. The Jews kept to themselves. They married amongst themselves. There wasn't that much interaction between the communities, except in the business world. Socially, there wasn't much, you know. So I'd say not Arab, you know, we're not Arab Jews.
It is a term that you'll hear more and more often.
Although
I would leave it. We have 5 more minutes.
One last question for each of you. One last question. Why, then, in your opinion, has this history been erased? Why do we not know about it?
Well, several reasons. I think in the Israeli case, they did the right thing. They absorbed their refugees. And the Palestinian case is actually the exception. It's the counterintuitive exception to the rule. You know, it's actually, you know, not a humane solution to their problem at all to keep them in camps or to deprive them of citizenship, to deprive them of jobs and property in Lebanon. You know, and this situation was allowed by the international community to go on. And the Arabs were never called to account for treating their Palestinian refugees in that way. So therefore, the whole conflict was allowed to go on for that reason. And I do believe that if the case of the Jewish refugees from Arab countries is given more prominence, people will see that 2 sets of refugees of roughly equal numbers, you know, a roughly equal exchange of populations did occur, and that this might help achieve a kind of reconciliation between the 2 sides. You know, and certainly it should be, you know, part of a peace settlement that's based on truth. You know, because first of all, 50% of the Jews of this country will not accept a peace settlement that does not take into account their rights. And that means rights to recognition, and it does mean also rights to compensation, and hopefully some solution will be found to that. You know, we need a peace settlement based on truth. And those Jews who did not go to Israel, like the 200,000 like my family, are also entitled to compensation. So perhaps an international fund can be set up to give compensation to individual refugees.
That would require us to think very differently about who we are, and it would require us to kind of fly against our own national mythology and treat ourselves as refugees and not as people who wanted to leave anyway, which is very difficult for people of a Zionist mindset. One last question for you, Krimash. One of the interesting details in this book that I mentioned earlier was that the author mentions in this whole book about the partition this incredibly complicated and very sensitive account of partition. She mentions one other conflict, and it's this one. There's a paragraph in the book about her being in Ramallah and experiencing Nakba Day protests in Ramallah and on the borders of Israel. This happened a few years ago, and she says that the Israeli army is suppressing these protests in order to suppress the memories of what happened to the Palestinians. And she leaves it there, without a sense of the complexities that are in play on both sides here. So she's very sensitive to all sides in her own conflict, but not very aware of the complexities here. How much do people in India know about what happened here in 1947, 1948?
Okay, it's going to be challenged to keep it short, but I will keep it short. It's a long answer. I can say this with almost confidence that there is almost no knowledge at large about the creation of the state of Israel in India. it's disturbingly knowledge gap, tremendous. So it's a problem of just not knowing this part of the world, or the history of the Jewish people, Holocaust, or the Jews who came from the Middle East. The second problem in India, Indian academia or civil society, is that because of the political nature of the relations between India and Israel, or because of the politics of the national movement, which supported the Palestinian cause than the Jewish cause, the academia and the civil society, media, have a very anti-Zionist understanding. It's true, when I came to Delhi to do masters in a globally known university, I got to know Israel as a settler state coming out of the Europe, settling in the East. It took me time to realize the complexity as well. So there is a knowledge gap. There is absolutely no knowledge, ignorance, which is no fault of anybody. It's a third world country. We don't have universities, by the way. So that's one thing. Second is the bias and the prejudice of this kind. The third thing which is in India, which is interesting, there is a fascination also, and it's a quite rising fascination, I must tell you, all of you. Young Indians do get fascinated with Mossad and army, and which is also a very, very essentialized understanding of any place. To me, it's like falling in love without knowing the other and the complexity of the other, which is equally dangerous as the ignorance can be. So it reduces Israel to something aggressive. So yes, I must tell all of you, if you have a concern about this reality, please read about Center for Israel Studies. This is what we are doing in a humble way.
Of course. I was just going to refer you, if you're interested, to a wonderful article that Raj wrote about Ben-Gurion and Nehru, and Ben-Gurion's unrequited love for India. Ben-Gurion had one picture of a leader up in his room, and it was Gandhi. That was the picture he had up, and he wrote letters, love letters almost, to Nehru saying, please be our friends, we're like you. Nothing. He got nowhere, and the relationship didn't go anywhere at the time, although it seems to be improving recently. I would like to thank the museum for hosting us, and to the organizers and the ambassador and everyone who came. I'll say one last thing, which struck me when I was reading this book. The author has an uncle. The author lives in India. The author has an uncle. The family's from Lahore. And the author has an uncle who remained in Pakistan after partition. The family left for India because they were Hindu. The uncle was left behind in the family house, converted to Islam, and lived his life as a Pakistani Muslim. And decades later, she goes back and finds him. And he has a very complicated identity and a complicated idea of himself, but she writes, and I think it's very, very interesting. He watched Indian soap operas, she said, on TV, and he watched Indian cricket, and he secretly rooted for the Indian side. And although he told me, she says, that his home in Lahore was the only home he had ever known, it was to India that he turned for a sense of home. So he's in his home, literally in his physical home, but he thinks that his home might be somewhere else. And then she says, there's a word in Punjabi that is enormously evocative and emotive for most Punjabis. And she says this word means home, country, land, and the word is watan. Watan, which is an Arabic word. And if you talk to a Jew from Iraq, they could use the word watan to mean Iraq. Or they could use the word watan to mean the land of Israel. And we all have complicated senses of home and where it is and where it isn't. And that word was, interestingly, another link between stories that I always thought were completely separate, and I'm increasingly beginning to think of them as being very similar. But thank you so much for coming, and I hope that we can continue.
I feel the gratitude to all of you who have indulged Charles and myself in coming here today. I feel the deep gratitude towards Dan and Leora, my absolute partner, because without her this event would never have taken off. Immensely indebted to Matti, to Lynn, and to Kim Braj, because they have invested time in thinking about this subject. This subject this was not meant to be a lecture, this was not meant to be a conversation, this was meant to be the beginning of a conversation. So I really, really thank you for your time, and I wish you many more interesting evenings sharing ideas, and I hope that we will be on this journey together. Thank you again, and allow me just to give some gifts. This is for you, and this is for you.